If you're seeing this, it's not an accident. You've been separated for far longer than you realize. Not recently, not suddenly. This didn't start when things began to feel different. It started long before you had language for it, long before you understood what was being done to you, long before you could even recognize the pattern. You were set apart early, and everything you've experienced since then has been shaped by that one decision. This wasn't random. It was selection. There were moments when you felt out of place and you didn't know why. You could be surrounded by people, conversations, noise, and still feel like something in you did not belong to any of it. Not because you were better, not because you were worse, but because you were not built to merge. You were built to stand separate. That feeling wasn't confusion, it was alignment. God marked you before you understood what that meant, before you had the ability to interpret it, before you could resist it or question it. And because of that, your life didn't follow the same pattern as everyone around you. Things didn't stick the same way. People didn't stay the same way. Paths didn't open the same way. You weren't rejected. You were set apart. There were connections that ended without explanation, situations that collapsed right when they seemed stable, opportunities that looked perfect on the surface but dissolved before they could fully form. You thought something was wrong, but nothing was wrong. It was separation in motion. God does not allow what is common to settle inside what is chosen. That's why certain environments never felt right for long. That's why certain relationships turn heavy without warning. That's why you could feel a shift before anything visibly changed. Because you were never meant to root yourself in what was temporary. You were being pulled out again and again, even when you tried to stay. This wasn't random, it was protection. You've noticed it. You've seen how people can stay in places that slowly drain them, and they don't even question it. They adapt, they normalize it, they become part of it. You couldn't, even when you tried, even when it would have been easier. Something in you refused to fully settle. That resistance wasn't rebellion. It was design. You were not wired for comfort that cost your purpose. And that's why your life has felt like a constant movement between phases, a constant breaking of attachments, a constant reshaping of direction. Not because you're unstable, because you're being refined. The chosen are not allowed to stay the same. You've gone through cycles that don't make sense to other people, periods of isolation that came without warning, silence that replaced noise, distance that replaced closeness. And every time it happened, it felt like something was being taken from you. But it wasn't being taken. It was being removed. There's a difference. Loss leaves emptiness. Removal creates space. And God does not create space without intention. You've been cleared, piece by piece, layer by layer, connection by connection, until what remains is something that cannot be influenced the way it used to be. You are harder to access now, not emotionally closed, but spiritually guarded. This wasn't random. It was preparation. There were times when you tried to go back to what felt familiar, back to people who once felt aligned, back to versions of yourself that seemed easier to live with. But it never held, because once separation begins, reversal is no longer an option. You can visit the past, but you cannot live there again. God doesn't separate you just to test you. He separates you to position you. And positioning requires distance. Distance from noise. Distance from influence. Distance from anything that can distort what has been placed inside you. You've been kept away from things you thought you needed. And now you're starting to understand why. Because what you carry cannot be developed in crowded spaces. It cannot grow in environments built for conformity. It requires isolation. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough for you to hear without interference. Long enough for you to see without distraction. Long enough for you to become without imitation. You were never meant to blend in. You were meant to become clear. This wasn't random. It was assignment. There are people who will never understand your path, not because they're incapable, but because they were never called into it. They were not chosen for what you were chosen for. The 144,000 are not identified by comfort. They are identified by separation. By the way, their lives refuse to follow predictable patterns. By the way, their environments shift before stagnation can take hold. By the way, they are constantly moved out of spaces that others spent years trying to remain in. You've lived that. You felt that. And now you're starting to recognize it. You are not behind. You are not lost. You are being aligned. Every delay had direction. Every disruption had purpose. Every ending carried instruction, even when it didn't look like it, even when it felt like nothing was working. God was not absent in those moments. He was active, quietly redirecting, quietly removing, quietly separating. Because what is chosen cannot be built in the same environment as what is common. And you are not common. You've tried to be. At times, you wanted to be, because it looked easier. It looked stable. It looked predictable. But every time you moved toward it, something in your life shifted and pulled you back out. That wasn't coincidence. That was correction. You are not allowed to settle for what does not match what's been placed inside you. And that's why your life has felt different. Not harder, different. Because it's not operating under the same rules. This wasn't random. It was design. You've been separated longer than you think. Before the awareness. Before the questions. Before the understanding. And now that you're starting to see it clearly, everything begins to make sense. The isolation. The shift. The endings. The distance. It wasn't chaos. It was order you didn't recognize yet. You were being taken out of alignment with what you were never meant to stay connected to. And now, you are standing in a place where the separation is no longer confusing. It's confirming. You see the pattern. You feel the difference. And you no longer question why your life didn't look like everyone else's. Because it was never supposed to. You are chosen. Not recently. From the beginning. And everything you've lived through has been shaping you into that reality. And now you can no longer pretend you don't see it. Because once awareness arrives, denial stops working. You've reached a point where the patterns are too clear to ignore. The same cycles, the same sudden endings, the same feeling of being pulled away right when something begins to settle. It's no longer confusing. It's consistent. And consistency reveals intention. This wasn't random. It was guidance. You were never drifting. You were being directed. There were moments when everything went quiet around you. Not peaceful quiet, but a kind of silence that forced you inward. No distractions, no external validation, No voices telling you what to do next. Just you. And that silence felt heavy, because it removed everything you used to rely on. But that was the point. God does not speak clearly through noise. He separates you from it first. And you've been brought into silence more times than you can count. Not to punish you, but to recalibrate you. You weren't rejected. You were redirected. There's a difference between being alone and being set apart. Loneliness comes from disconnection. Separation comes from purpose. And what you experienced was not emptiness. It was positioning. You were placed in environments where you couldn't lean on others the way you used to. Situations where advice didn't help, where support felt limited, where you had to make decisions without reassurance. That wasn't abandonment. That was development. Because what God is building in you cannot depend on external confirmation. It has to stand on its own. You've been trained to trust something deeper, not opinions, not trends, not comfort, but alignment. And alignment doesn't come from following the crowd. It comes from being removed from it. This wasn't random. It was construction. There were times when you questioned your own reactions, why you couldn't tolerate certain behaviors, why certain conversations drained you, why certain environments felt unbearable even when everyone else seemed fine. You thought you were overthinking. You thought you were too sensitive. You thought something in you was off, but nothing was off. You were detecting what others had learned to ignore. And because of that, you couldn't stay where misalignment existed. Even if you tried, even if you wanted to. Something in you rejected it. That wasn't weakness. That was clarity. You are not built to normalize what contradicts your purpose. And that's why your tolerance has decreased over time. You don't have the same patience for things that once felt acceptable. You don't have the same attachment to what once felt important. You don't have the same need to be understood by people who were never meant to understand you. Because you've been separated. And separation changes your standard. This wasn't random. It was elevation. You've noticed how your circle has shifted. Not gradually, but suddenly. People disappearing. Conversations fading. Connections dissolving without conflict. No arguments. No dramatic endings. Just distance. That kind of separation doesn't come from you forcing it. It comes from God removing what no longer aligns. You didn't push them away. They were moved out of your path. Because what you're stepping into cannot carry everything you used to hold. Some connections are seasonal. Some are structural. And God knows the difference. You were never meant to carry everyone forward. You were meant to move forward clean. You weren't rejected. You were refined. There's a version of you that no longer exists. Not because you lost it, but because you outgrew it. And growth, when it's real, creates separation. It separates you from old patterns, old responses, old attachments, old identities. And that process doesn't feel comfortable because it requires letting go of what once defined you. But what once defined you was never the final version. It was a stage, and you've moved beyond it. This wasn't random. It was progression. You're starting to notice that your decisions come from a different place now. Less reaction, more awareness, less urgency, more precision. You don't move the same way. You don't respond the same way. You don't attach the same way. Because you've been reshaped, not by circumstances alone, but by intention. God has been adjusting your internal structure, your thinking, your perception, your priorities, so that when the next phase opens, you won't enter it the same way you entered the last one. You will move with clarity, with control, with understanding, because you've been prepared. This wasn't random, it was assignment. The chosen are not just separated from people. They are separated from versions of themselves that cannot carry the assignment. And you've experienced that. Moments where you no longer recognized how you used to think, how you used to react, how you used to tolerate. That disconnect is not confusion. It's transformation. You are not who you were. And you cannot go back to being that version again. Not because you are trying not to, but because it no longer fits. You've been upgraded internally, quietly, without announcement. And now your external life is starting to reflect that shift. Opportunities will align differently. People will approach you differently. Situations will unfold differently because you are no longer operating at the same level. This wasn't random. It was activation. You are stepping into a phase where the separation is no longer about removal. It's about distinction. You won't just feel different. You will be recognized as different, not by everyone, but by those who are aligned with what you carry. And that recognition won't come from effort. It will come from presence, from the way you move, from the way you speak, from the way you see things others overlook. Because what's been built in you is now ready to be expressed. You were hidden for a reason, and now you're being revealed with intention. You are chosen, not by chance, by design. This wasn't random, it was confirmation.